I appreciate you tuning in. I know that we're still, in many ways, having to do things virtually. We long for the day, and maybe that may not be too far down the road in which we can come together and meet in person, and we hope that day will be soon. I ask you to keep praying for it. But tonight, we are doing this virtually once again, and I want to begin tonight by sharing with you a little bit of history that you may be familiar with that leads into our study for this evening. It was prior to what has come to be known as the Panic of 1873. There was a convention, if you will, of the Young Men's Christian Association in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This group had gathered, and two specific individuals of note were there. These names may not mean anything to you, but one of them plays out very importantly in where we're going this evening. But anyway, one of those individuals was what we might call a delegate. His name was Erastus Johnson. The other man was a man by the name of John Wanamaker, and he was the president of the convention that year. On the second day of the convention, a telegram arrived from Philadelphia, and it did not bear good news. If anything, it stated that the banking house of John Cook and Company had failed. As a result, Mr. Wanamaker, who had invested heavily with that particular investment firm, found himself having to suffer quite a loss. It wasn't long before some other reports started trickling in about other companies and banks which were also beginning to fail. And that set off what came to be known as the Panic of 1873, which would last through 1875. Well, according to Mr. Johnson, he said a cloud of gloom spread over the convention because nearly all the members were men of business. It prompted him to sit down and to begin writing words to what would become a hymn. He gave that hymn a name. You will recognize the name, or I believe many of you will. The name of the hymn is "The Rock That Is Higher Than I." I want you to listen to the words to that hymn as he penned them all those years ago. In the first stanza we find these words, "Oh, sometimes the shadows are deep, and rough seems the path to the goal, and sorrows sometimes how they sweep like tempest over the soul." The second stanza, "Oh, sometimes how long seems the day, and sometimes how dreary my feet, but toiling in life's dusty way, the rock's blessed shadow, how sweet." The third stanza, "Then near to the rock let me keep, if blessings or sorrows prevail, or climbing the mountain's way steep, or walking the shadowy vale." And finally the refrain, "Oh, then to the rock let me fly, to the rock that is higher than I. Oh, then to the rock let me fly, to the rock that is higher than I." The psalm from which this hymn draws its inspiration is Psalm 61, another one of those hymns that was written by David so long ago. And the wording of that particular psalm has caused several commentators upon the psalm to suggest that it is rooted in a historical series of events that we find recorded for us in the Old Testament. It's the situation involving David and those who were loyal to him in the time when they had to flee from Jerusalem and go to a place on the other side of the Jordan River, to the east of the Jordan River, known as Mahanaim, there in the land of Gilead. In 2 Samuel chapter 17, beginning in verse 27 and going to the end of that chapter, we find the circumstances revealed for us that were confronting them as they took refuge there in Mahanaim. Listen to what is recorded for us. "Now when David had come to Mahanaim, Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbah, of the sons of Ammon, Machir, the son of Amiel from Lo-debar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought beds, basins, pottery, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, parched seeds, honey, curds, sheep, and cheese of the herd, for David and for the people who were with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary, and thirsty in the wilderness. As we look tonight at Psalm 61, I would like for you to consider, to keep your mind, if you will, upon David's situation and consider the petition which he brings before God. If you look at Psalm 61, you'll notice that this psalm begins, as so many other of David's psalms, in which he calls out to God and requests God's help in his life. He says this in verses 1 and 2, "Hear my cry, O God, give heed to my prayer. From the end of the earth I call to you when my heart is faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I." Well, David has found himself in such a difficult situation that he calls out to the only one who thinks he is able to help him, who he believes is able to help him, and that one is God. And so as he calls out, twice he asks for God to listen to him. He says, "Hear my cry, give heed, listen to, or attend to my prayer." There are two aspects of David's situation which weigh heavily upon him. The first is something he says here at the beginning of verse 2. He says, "From the end of the earth I call to you." Well, that suggests that David is a good ways away from Jerusalem. And so, if David is hiding out in Mahanaim, then David considers himself to be a long way from his homeland, and even more, a long way from the presence of God there in the temple in Jerusalem. And that is what bothers him, is that he is so far away from God. And the result of that distance between him and God, he said that it is causing his heart to feel faint. It's taking its toll upon him mentally and emotionally. It's disheartening to him, discouraging. It's causing him to be weak. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever found yourself distant from God, spiritually speaking? And does that distance from God bother you to the point that it makes you actually weak? Spiritually weak? Struggling with things in your life? Well, that's where David found himself. And because of that, David asked God to do something for him. He makes a request. He says, "Lead me to the rock that is higher than I." The rock of which David was speaking was a place that he considered to be safe and secure, a place where he could escape his oppressors. It was a place of protection. But there was something that David knew, and that was that David knew that such a place was unattainable to him by his own strength. Only God could lead him to that place. And the rock to which only God could lead him was not so much a place, a physical location, as it was a person. And that person was God. God was David's rock, who was higher than himself. As a matter of fact, David expresses that and connects it with his own previous experiences, as we see in verse 3. He says, "For you have been a refuge for me, a tower of strength against the enemy." God had never failed David. When he needed a refuge, God had been there for him. And David speaks of God as being two things to him. Number one, he speaks of God as being a refuge for him, a shelter from danger when it was most needed. And secondly, he speaks of God as being a tower of strength against the enemy. God was David's defender from all harm. And even as God had been David's shelter in the past, God's defender or tower of strength in the past, so David believed that God could be that yet again. And David makes his request. His desire is to dwell with God forever. Look at what he writes as we find it in verses 4 and 5 of our English text. He says, "Let me dwell in your tent forever. Let me take refuge in the shelter of your wings. For you have heard my vows, O God. You have given me the inheritance of those who fear your name." He begins, first of all, by saying, "Let me dwell in your tent forever." In Psalm 27 and verse 5, David had written of God, "For in the day of trouble he will conceal me in his tabernacle. In the secret place of his tent he will hide me. He will lift me up on a rock." David knew God would do this. And then there's that passage that so many of us are familiar with in the 23rd Psalm, what we've come to know as the Shepherd's Psalm. in which David makes that confident assertion at the end of the psalm, and he says, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Well, here, David longs to dwell in God's presence throughout the rest of his life. But he also asks God to let him take shelter in the refuge in the shelter of God's wings. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 11, it was Moses who said that God is like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that hovers over its young. He said he spread his wings and caught them. He carried them on his pinions. This is what God does for those who are his. Well, David, no doubt, picked up on this because in Psalm 17, verse 8, he would write there that he asked God to hide me in the shadow of your wings. And in Psalm 36, verse 7, David declared, how precious is your loving kindness, O God, and the children of men take refuge in the shadow of your wings. You see, what David wanted was to keep as closely as possible to the presence of God, to the shelter which God would provide for him. The second thing that David brings out, this time in verse 5, is his assurance, why he believes that God would do this, why God would allow him to dwell in his tent forever and allow him to take shelter underneath God's wings. It is because of what God has done. He says, for you have heard my vows, O God. David's vows were promises that he had made to God. We're not told what they were or anything else about them other than David had made vows to God. And these vows had arisen from a troubled heart in the midst of a crisis. And through these vows, what David had professed was unwavering commitment to God of some sort, even in the face of overwhelming trouble that he was experiencing. Not only did he say of God, you have heard my vows, but he also says of God, you have given me the inheritance of those who fear your name. Well, the ending of Absalom's rebellion, which seems to have taken place, and David and his people may be preparing to go back to Jerusalem, but the end of Absalom's rebellion brought with it the restoration of those loyal Israelites to Jerusalem. Those who had fled out of loyalty to David and to God were now able to go back home. And they had, by showing their fear of God's name, they had adhered to that king whom God had chosen, and that king was David. And as a result of that, David knew that God would restore that heritage that was to be his, or the inheritance that God had promised to him. And that inheritance, that heritage, was something that God had spoken through Abraham all those years ago, in which not only did he promise the land to Abraham's descendants after him, but also he promised to sit a man upon the throne, and that individual would be in the lineage of Abraham. In the last 3 verses of this psalm, David prays a prayer, and the prayer that David prays is a prayer for the king. Of course, the king is David. But I believe that the prayer is not just for David himself, but it would be a prayer that would reach forward into perpetuity for those who were David's descendants. Listen to what he says. He says, you will prolong the king's life. His years will be as many generations. He will abide before God forever. Appoint loving kindness and truth that they may preserve him. Well, I've just read to you from the New American Standard Translation, and it treats it more as confident assertions on David's part, but it seems that they were questions or requests that David makes. Listen to it from the English Standard Version. He says there, prolong the life of the king. May his years endure to all generations. May he be enthroned forever before God. So what is it that David is requesting of God? David is making a request of God that God would prolong the life of the king, that is, of himself and for those who would follow him, that his life might last for many generations as he sat upon the throne, ruling faithfully over God's people. But he also prayed that God would continue to protect him and the king who would follow him through his loving kindness and his truth. Time and again in the Old Testament, we read of the loving kindness of God and how God shows that loving kindness, that steadfast loyalty or love to those who are faithful to him to the 1000th generation. The reason for such a request that David makes is so that he might abide before God forever, or as the English Standard Version says, enthroned forever before the Lord. That is for the rest of his life. Having made this request of God, David ends this hymn with, or this psalm, with a concluding vow of praise. He says, "So I will sing praise to your name forever, that I may pay my vows day by day." What is he doing? David's making a final promise to God. And that final promise to God is, I will sing your praise forever, as long as you give me breath. And I will do it day by day as I am fulfilling those promises which I made to you. David was confident that God would hear him and that he would respond to his plea. And that's why I believe he ends this psalm in this way. Now, having looked at this psalm, the question for us this evening is this: what is it we're to take from it? We're 3,000 years removed from David. We're not dealing with Absalom or going back to the city of our forefathers. No, we live in the United States, and our times are different. Or are they? I believe that the lesson we're to take from this is this, and that is that even as David longed for God to lead him to the rock that was higher than himself, so you and I are to turn to the Lord, who is our rock, and put our faith and our trust in him as Christians and build our lives upon who he is and upon the promises which he has made to us. You may remember that Peter confessed Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said to Peter that upon this confession, upon this, I will build my church, this rock. I will build my church upon it. The promise that, or the confession that I'm the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he said, and the gates of Hades, of death, will not prevail against it. We understand that. Not only that, we understand that Jesus is our rock. He is the rock of ages. He is the one to whom we turn. He alone is our refuge in the storms of life, the one who protects us from our human foes and adversaries. But even more, Jesus is that rock who grants us refuge against the wrath of God that is to be poured out upon those who do not obey the gospel and who do not turn to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior in their lives. In Romans chapter 5, verse 9, Paul said that because we as Christians have been justified by that blood of Christ, he says we will be saved from the wrath of God through him. So as I conclude this night, I want to ask you, will you come to the rock that is higher than yourself? Jesus Christ, the rock of ages? And will you find in him your refuge, your tower of strength against the enemy, Satan? If you will, I believe that your life will be blessed. And I want to encourage you to do that, to seek him while he may be found, because there will be a time when we can no longer seek him and find him. If we can help you in that, please contact us here at the Waverly Church of Christ. Let us know of your desire, and we will sit down and do what we can to help you, to encourage you, to study with you, to fulfill that obedience to God. Thank you tonight for studying this word with us, and may God bless you and keep you during these times.